As we begin to grapple with the ideas that tend to stigmatize our nation from all fronts, arguing from perhaps an intellectual point of view, a logical point of view, a spiritual point of view, and a moral point of view. You could summarize all that is happening with this idea of homosexuality as a debate in African jurisprudence, or perhaps better placed in African countries, whether or not this is a foreign issue and therefore should be tackled with an eye or a lens of trying to understand exactly what this would mean to the African people in terms of culture, but in terms of the practice. I know for a fact that there's documented information that has been written in terms of the preposition that homosexuality may have existed in the African tradition for some time. But that is a question of debate, as we shall see. Those of you who will be privileged to read our book, Strength Mythology, you will be able to comprehend and understand a little bit of those things. But I would like to remind ourselves of an address to the British Parliament on the 2nd February 1835, where Lord Macaulay said that I have traveled across the length and the breadth of Africa, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth have I seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such high caliber, that I do not think that we could ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if the African thinks that what is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them to become, a truly dominated nation. That was made by Lord Macaulay, addressing the British Parliament on 2nd February 1835. So it doesn't surprise us when we begin to have issues that have to do with jurisprudence that has taken over, beginning with court interpretation. For example, if you remember the case of Ara versus Amkeo, those of you who are well conversant with constitutional law, or perhaps a little bit of law, foundations of law, call it criminal law, you may find that in Ara versus Amkeo, again, Justice Hamilton said that the issue of wife or dowry perhaps was an issue of wife's purchase, and according to him, marriage was a union by virtue of height versus height between a man and a woman, as understood in the Christendom. And we believed the story. We believed whatever they brought us. And they told us that most of our laws, as long as they are not, they are repugnant to the extent of their inconsistence, then they will be null and void. We believed everything they brought us. They told us polygamy was bad. We believed that. Not until some scholars began understanding perhaps a little of what they are doing in terms of jurisprudence, or changing the culture of this country, or of the African tradition per se. So if you look at Alai versus Uganda, things began changing, where now for the first time we are arguing that the idea of bride price is not a question of simply wife purchase or reducing a wife into some kind of chattel or cattle for that purpose. And that is reminiscent in Mifumi and 12 others versus Attorney General, and a number of other cases that have come to make that affirmation. So the debate that we have today is whether or not most of these ideologies that have been posed upon us or grafted upon our system of African culture can be wholly embraced or should be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, I'm not here to argue in terms of the moral perspective, but I'm here to argue in terms of a self-conscious righteousness of your righteous mind. That could it be that we have been hoodwinked? Could it be that we've been bamboozled, taken for a ride? Could it be that there are certain things we ought to understand and analyze before we begin embracing them? From where I come from, it is clearly understood that the people who ordinarily would use whatever gadgets, and I'm using the word gadgets sparingly, to impose them or to force them into the anal or anus for that purpose of a human being, were people who were wizards. And wizardry was known to be in certain cultures, so every time they got hold of a wizard, they would get a raw matoke and push this matoke behind the anus or the anal canal of this individual. And it was a statement of an affirmation that whatever this guy was doing was despotic and was not right in society. And that's the closest semblance you can come to when it comes to the issue of using whatever gadget to penetrate the earth. And we have had a great debate in our book called Sphinx Mythology, where we make arguments in terms of how homosexuality began and what's going to happen tomorrow if we embrace and begin to argue and accommodate these cultures or these entities just under the ideology of human rights. If they are arguing, or if we're arguing that polygamy is not perhaps a human right, and now we're making a proposition that homosexuality is a human right which has to be protected and has connotations that have to do with financial attachments, then the bigger question we're going to ask ourselves is, how long will we play this game along? Because perhaps we as a culture, as a people, have to be blamed to some extent. Listen, we know that conventions are there that provide for those rights, and there's been judicial interpretation in terms of jurisprudence. I'll give you just an example of the case that happened in Kenya, where they argued in terms of whether or not these LGBT had the rights to, or the mandate to do what they're doing. And rightly so, the courts pointed out that that was a human right. But in the spectacle, or in the eyes of these judicial personalities, they were looking at it in terms of a distinction between sex and sexual orientation. The bigger question therefore becomes, if we are to argue in terms of sex, can we argue that homosexuality is something that is confined within the true definition of sex, as enshrined within nature, as opposed to sexual orientation? And that's why the judicial officers went that way. And perhaps that's the bigger question that the members of parliament, even as they begin to debate on this issue, should be alive to. The distinction between sex in terms of gender as opposed to sexual orientation. Because listen, the moment we begin to embrace those ideologies, then we are opening up a can of worms. Like we rightly say, these entities came and claimed, beautiful things to do with the rainbow and assumed to be theirs. Even the very use of the word gay, for example. Those of you who remember, the true interpretation of the word gay would have surmount to something that is nice, pleasant, without now the connotation Words can have denotative and connotative meanings, without now the connotation that has been ascribed to the word gay. And even the argument of the rainbow, for example, the beautiful colors of the rainbow, which now are being used to signify an entity as a justification of that, support for that kind of ideology. Like His Excellency was saying, it's not a question of really hating or perhaps making vile statements against this kind of practice, but it's a question of saying, listen, if you believe in what you do, you may have your so-called right to do what you want to do, but then don't create it, don't impose it on other people. Don't go to schools and begin to implant it in the kids. Don't put monetary connotations on it. Maybe the non-gay people are to be blamed. Why are we so dependent on money that has, connotations to do with gay? Are we lazy? Are they lazy enough that they have to depend on these people to give them the money? Maybe it's time to make a statement that with or without the money, we can stand firmly. We can make our own money without compromising our own self-righteousness in terms of consciousness or in terms of ideals and aspirations that define us as a people. What is going to happen tomorrow? You're going to open up a can of worms. As I said, they came, they told you this was bad, you disbanded them. Now they bring another story. Listen, LGBT now has added a Q, queer behaviors. What's going to happen? What's going to happen tomorrow when they begin to make arguments in terms of bestiality, which is happening already, where people now are actually getting married to animals, getting sexual pleasures or gratifications with animals, and whatever animal. What's going to happen? What is going to happen? I think this is a rise or an attack. This is a battle of Armageddon. And for those of you who have the self-righteousness to believe in, first of all, your conscience, but also making a distinction between nature and nurture, because nurture affects. Some people are instigated into this kind of behavior because they are propounded by the society that is around them, and therefore they're inculcated in this kind of behavior. So this ideology of whether or not it's a question of DNA or genetics has been demystified by a number of scientists. Even in the book that I'm talking about, that we wrote, there is nothing genetical in terms of an orientation that will cause a person to be inclined to love their own male or female for that purpose. There is no scientific justification for that. The only justification is nature. The idea that these people are inculcated, and therefore for the lack of perhaps a better way of trying to simply know that this is a question of a perversion, they now try to force it on the majority of the people, and Africa as a target. Most of you remember, those of you who used to watch movies a lot, the movies that used to come, we had, by culture, we had even a disgust to things that had to do with, what they call sexual orgies, where you see women or men perhaps using their mouth to sexually gratify their partners. It was a dilemma to us because it was something inconceivable. That's not how our culture understood things. And you'll argue and say, listen, you are arguing from that old point of view. I think that's not the question. The question is, if you're saying we're arguing from an old point of view, why don't you give us the right to believe in the things that we think make us better as an entity or as an individual? And we may not be very concerned so much about the things that you do in the privacy of your rooms, but when you take them out of your rooms and you begin to impose them on a nation, or a people and then put financial connotations on them, I think they become a problem. If you choose to be stupid because that's how you choose to think, and I say that with maximum respect, so be it. I would like to say I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. So these ideologies of trying to propound ideas from other jurisdictions under the argument that this is how things are supposed to be, to me becomes a question of debate. And you see, all the things have implications, whether financial or otherwise. And that's the bigger question. Many of the young people today in Africa, the majority of Africans perhaps, who may find themselves engaged in this kind of ideology, would do so not really because their souls and hearts are in it, but because of the financial gain. And that's the reason why you see that most of the thing has now been attached to the financial gain. The better question is, this is a battle of Armageddon, where we need to come up and stand on our 2 feet and make an affirmation that we as a people believe in things as they are meant to be. We believe in order, in pattern, in logic, in intelligence. All those 4 principles would present a picture for you that certain things are meant to be done in certain ways as ordained by nature, as opposed to nurture. And therefore, when you get your perversions and implant them on a society because you feel you have a sexual gratification to do that way, it's a question of common sense. That's what Malcolm X used to say. They hoodwink you, they get in your brain, they get out of that brain, and they make you think that what is wicked is now right. They even plant it in churches and they make scripture interpretations, false scripture interpretations of people in the Bible who were allegedly homosexuals. That all is not right if you look at the true interpretation of scripture. I just told you about people who are now talking about objectophilia as a sexual orientation. They are free to marry. A woman married the elf of France, and she calls her name by that. Another one married the Great Wall of China. And all these things are being done in our own eyes. And we're busy clapping and applauding, forgetting that it is coming up to reach a cancer that is developing within us, to root us and to destroy the kind of ambitions that we had as a culture. I think it's time that we rise up and understand the evils that come with this issue. And the point is not to segregate or to victimize or to malign them or to send them off, but to speak back consciousness into their souls and spirits, so that we begin to understand that not everything that you think is right because someone is doing it is going to be right. So that is a message that I would like us to appreciate and to comprehend. We will continue at a later time. This is just the beginning.